good morning, everybody. I hope you're all managing to join us without too many technical issues. I take great pleasure in opening this webinar today. We're going to be talking about a subject that's very important and particularly close to my heart, and that is the issue around male victims of domestic abuse. If I could just let everybody know that today's webinar is going to be recorded and will be sent out to all of those who are registered to attend today. So there'll be an opportunity for you to review what we've discussed after the event. The recording is going to be available on our knowledge bank, and we'll share the link in our newsletters and socials. If I could just encourage everybody here today, if you're interested in what we're doing as an organisation as a whole, then please do sign up for our newsletter, follow us on social media, and share and comment on our social media present wherever you can. All of the information about our social media and how to get in touch with us will be available in the chat during the seminar and will be sent to you after the event as well. Following today's event, we will be sending you a short survey monthly evaluation, which I would encourage everybody to please complete. We are still very much in a learning phase as an organisation about how we communicate with the world in general. So any hints and tips that you can give us in the evaluation would be much appreciated. So without too much further ado, I will introduce our panelists. We have an absolutely amazing panel joining us today. I think it's the first seminar we've done where we've actually got people representing all the different parts of the UK. So that in itself is a massive pleasure for us to have. If I could start off by introducing Claire Corky, who's the coordinator at the Men's Advisory Project in Northern Ireland. And Claire, if you could just say a few words about yourself, please.
Good morning. So yes, as Andrew said there, I'm the coordinator with the Men's Advisory Project. Fully trained counsellor as well, and I've had a couple of different roles within the same organisation: support work, housing support, things like that. We work with any man who has experienced domestic abuse in Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Claire. And if I could then go across to Mark Brooks, please. And it's Mark Brooks, OBE, and he's the chair of the Mankind Initiative. You have to give credit where you do. If you've got a gong, we have to make sure everybody knows about it.
Well, how kind. And so I'm always go a bit red about that. So so Mark Brooks, I'm the chair of the trustees of the Mankind Initiative charity. So we operate primarily in England. We run a helpline for male victims. I've been the chair for over 15 years now, and have developed some national service standards and advised government, and I'm representing England and particularly with this accent, South East London.
Thank you. Could I then go on to introduce Andrea Cooper, who is the safeguarding lead at the Older People's Commissioner's Office in Wales. So welcome to a fellow Welsh person. So Andrea, if you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. So, yeah, I'm Andrea Cooper, and stopping the abuse of older people is a key priority for the Older People's Commissioner for Wales, and I lead on the work within that area. So I'm a social worker by background, and before coming into this role, I spent around 23 years working in a local authority, mainly with older people and their families.
Thank you, Andrea. And then last but not least, and I'm so glad you've managed to join us, Geraldine. Do you need a moment to gather breath? Because you have been having some technical difficulties this morning, haven't you? So we've got Geraldine Hannah, who's the Northern Ireland Victim of Crime Commissioner Designate. You just introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hi, apologies for being late. I just had a normal typical government system nightmare of trying to get onto Zoom. So I'm now on my personal iPad, so I probably am not going to be as capable in terms of if there's anything in the chat. So if anybody asks anything there, please bring it to my attention. So I'm Geraldine Hannah. I'm Commissioner Designate for Victims of Crime in Northern Ireland. So I took a post in June of last year, and it's a new position in Northern Ireland, hence the designate title. So we're not yet on the statute books, so we're waiting for the government to be back in place in order to put through the legislation. But my role is to provide a voice to victims of all types of crime and really use that voice to champion change. I have a special designated interest in the areas of domestic abuse, sexual abuse and hate crime. So obviously the topic of today's webinar is extremely pertinent to our role, and I'm really pleased and that to be invited and to speak to you all today.
Thank you. And I should have said last but not, it is not last but not least. I think I'm just so pleased to see you, because I thought you were going to be this little voice in the ether. So next we have Fergus McQueen, who's the Training and Development Officer for Abused Men in Scotland. Fergus, who could introduce you too.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you.
Yep, I'm Fergus. I'm a Training and Development Officer over here at ANIS, Abused Men in Scotland. A lot of what I do is focused around kind of awareness raising, so really trying to advocate for this problem for abused men in Scotland, and yeah, I'm kind of learning as I go, like everyone else. So I'm really happy to be here. So thank you.
Thanks. And then Danny Taplow from Hourglass.
Thanks, Andrea. Yeah, I'm the Research and Policy Officer here at Hourglass. I've been with Hourglass for just over 5 years and get to do a lot related to the abuse of older people, really. So I'm just more of a broad look for people here, and sort of just to give the Hourglass perspective as well. Thank you.
And I'm Andrew Nicholas-Jones, and I'm a trustee of Hourglass and have been since I think about 2017. I'm the Wales member on the board, and in a previous life, I used to be responsible for our strategy for older people in Wales. So I have a particular interest in this area and have had for a number of years. So without further ado, I think I'd like to ask all of the panel a question, which I think really gets to the heart of why we're here today. So why is it important now that we start focusing specifically on male victims of abuse? So over to anybody who wants to jump in and answer first. I'm not going to be prescriptive, but if there's silence, I will point fingers. So who'd like to come in first on this subject?
I'll comment first on this, Andrea.
Well done, Danny.
That's right. I don't think sort of now, you say now it's important. It's always been important to focus on the abuse of older men, but unfortunately, older men and men in general, as victims of domestic abuse, have largely, or more than largely, been under-recognised as victims, ignored in data sets and in support services, and really sort of diminished and sort of dismissed. Thankfully, sort of as we can see, sort of from having a webinar like this and other means going on, money sort of given to men's organisations recently by the Home Office, that sort of hopefully this is starting to change. And it needs to be. For far too long, male victims and older male victims especially have just been pushed into a corner and not seen as legitimate victims of domestic abuse or other forms of abuse. And that really sort of, that leads to a number more problems. That leads to loneliness, that leads to suicide, that leads to issues that place on top of the abuse that these victims have suffered, with the disbelief that sort of the wider both domestic violence community, stakeholder community, and the general public, policymakers, when sort of older male victims and males in general are diminished, then it's sort of it's no good for anyone, least of all the victims themselves. So sort of to start, this should have happened many years ago, and sort of playing catch up, really. It's so important because it's, yeah, these victims are legitimate victims and they need to be seen as stuff they need to be supported as.
Thanks, Danny. Any other perspectives from the rest of the panel?
I'll come in if I may. Yeah. So I think abuse is it has been seen through this very gendered lens, really. And you know, there has been a big focus on the abuse of younger women, which is, you know, and obviously a very important issue. But we know that as men grow older, the gap between men and women decreases. So more men experience abuse as they grow older than when they're in younger age. So, you know, it's really important to look at this issue and to find out what's going on. And the Older People's Commissioner for Wales has a Stop in Abuse Action Group, and which is kind of attended by over 30 different interdisciplinary organisations. And they were being particularly concerned about the increase in the numbers of older men sort of contacting helplines and seeking support. So anecdotally as well, we have this sense that as men grow older, the risk of abuse increases. And as Danny said, they are quite an invisible or hidden demographic or population. So we need to attend to that.
Claire, did you have a comment?
Just, we obviously think it's important to be focusing on male victims. In Northern Ireland, 30% of any domestic abuse crimes that are reported happen to men, and 40% of domestic homicides that happen in Northern Ireland, men have been a victim of that. We do see and understand that, proportionately, there are a lot of female victims of domestic abuse, but we're here to speak up for the male victims.
Thank you. Those are interesting statistics, actually. I'd be interested to see how they match out across the rest of the UK, Danny. The reason I said now at the outset is I think since COVID, we've become a lot more aware of the issues that people are facing behind closed doors. So I think it's polarised a lot of the issues, particularly regarding male victims, certainly from our perspective, I think as a charity. So sorry for jumping in there, Mark.
Yes, I mean, just building on that. I mean, the statistics are broadly the same across the UK. I was just looking at some Office for National Statistics figures, which cover England and Wales. And broadly speaking, 1 in 3 victims of domestic abuse are male, and that's exactly the same for older men. So men over 60. There's 2 data sets now. There's 60 to 74 and 74 plus that the ONS actually capture, and that shows that broadly it's 1 in 3. But the key thing also is not always to look at the comparison between men and women. I mean, it's good for context, but it's not competition. So we should be looking at the volume. I always saying the actual volume, the numbers. But also, I think just to broaden the conversation, building on what Danny and colleagues have said, is that really we can't talk about having a inclusive society and recognizing diversity and equality if we're not recognizing male victims, which includes obviously men in gay same-sex relationships or adult family violence. And I think where we're trying to get the move to is actually recognizing male victims in their own right, because we live in a 360-degree world, and therefore you can't talk about equality and inclusion if you in this field if you're not also including male victims and also their children. And when we think about it, not only their immediate children when they're, if you like, under 16, but for our cohort, which we're discussing today, these are adult children and grandchildren often. They're all impacted if they've got, if their granddad or dad who's over 60, for example, is a victim. So, we have to think more broadly, not only the impact on the individual, but also their wider family as well when it comes to these matters. So this is an inclusion issue as much as it is a domestic abuse issue.
Thank you. Geraldine, do you have anything to add on this?
Yeah, I think it's really building on what's been said already. From our perspective, the issue is around how we respond to victims of domestic abuse. So in order to know how best to respond, whether that's in a preventative piece or in a response piece, we need to understand what the issues are affecting different groups of individuals. So the figures obviously are helpful, and data is a big issue for us in terms of being able to disaggregate the data so we can break it down into different groups. But I think the key is, for me, around focusing on male victims and in given this particular topic, older men, is around understanding what the impact is so we know how better to respond. So that evidence of their needs will help inform what our response is. So regardless of what numbers there are, we need to understand how this crime impacts on those people as individual and build our responses accordingly. And one of the key areas for priorities for our office is around data, and we recently commissioned Queen's University in Belfast to do a review of the experiences of men and boys with of intimate partner violence. And what that really highlighted was that there's a dearth of research there. So I think it was worldwide research rapid review. There was 67 studies that were identified. So only 67, and only 8 of those were from the UK, and none of them were from Northern Ireland. So certainly as a priority piece of work for our office, we're looking to do more research into the experience of men and boys. And what that rapid review highlighted was that men and boys are not just one group. And it's clear from the subject of today's webinar, the focus on older men. So we need to look at what is the experience of older men, what's the experience of gay men, trans men, what's the experience of urban men versus rural men, and then of course the whole intersectionality across that. But for me, the key point is we need to do the research, we need to understand the data in order to inform our response.
That's great, thank you. Has anybody got anything else to contribute on this question before we move on? I'd just be encouraging all the people participating today to please put your questions into the Q&A section so that we can get to them as promptly as we can as the seminar progresses. So from that, we actually move quite neatly, I think, into another issue, I think, which is really significant in this area. And that's around, we know that for domestic abuse and sexual violence, there is a massive issue around underreporting. But when we start talking about men as victims, what can we start doing to address underreporting in general, particularly with today's focus around underreporting for male victims, and particularly older victims of domestic abuse and sexual violence? Claire?
I think there needs to be an awareness piece for a lot of older men that we would speak to that maybe don't even recognise what's happening to them as abuse, or don't have the language in and around how to describe what's happening to them, or have been raised to believe that this isn't something you speak about, that you keep it in the family, you wouldn't speak out about other family members or about a partner. And so I think maybe an awareness piece about teaching men, what they might be experiencing may well be abuse.
Thanks. Anybody else? Andrea?
And I think as well it's about getting the message out there that men are victims of domestic abuse, because I think so many men probably don't report abuse because of feelings of shame and stigma. And certainly in the Commissioner's research on the domestic abuse of older men, there was a lot of concern amongst the male participants around reporting abuse. Are they going to be believed? Are they actually going to be seen as the perpetrator rather than the person experiencing that abuse? So I agree completely with what Claire has said around awareness raising and training for frontline practitioners as well to challenge their assumptions and to actually highlight the importance of keeping an open mind within these situations, and not to assume that they are automatically going to be aware of who is the perpetrator, who is the victim.
Thanks. Mark?
Yeah, I mean, just widening it somewhat. It is about not so much the frontline staff. Well, the frontline staff, sorry, Andrew, are really important, but it's those staff and professionals who may come across domestic abuse as part of their work, but it's not their everyday part of their work. I'm particularly thinking about GPs, where older men will obviously more likely to go to a GP than younger men. And it's basically if the GP is having that level of professional curiosity about what is, if men are presenting with injuries and saying, oh, well, you know, I'm old and doddery, etc. You know, asking about what's happening at home. Also, the same if they're depressed and anxious. And you know, I spoke to some of my my helpline colleagues, and we had some really long conversation yesterday about some of the nuances. So what we've certainly found is perpetrators, and talking about partners here, you know, claiming that the man has got early signs of dementia. That's why they need power of attorney. That's why they need control of the finances. We're seeing a lot of men calling us who are in where the abuse is happening in a second marriage, for example. And the issue is about whether the police, the social services, GPs, and finance and solicitors, obviously around power of attorney, are whether their spidey sense is attuned to thinking, actually, has he really got early signs of dementia? Is he really old and doddery, which is why he's, you know, presenting with injuries? So as much as we need to educate the men, we need to educate society, but also what I would call secondary services, the people who will come across male victims of domestic abuse, but it's not their, if you like, day job. It's not what they do all the time. That's where the weaknesses in the system generally are.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can say there's weaknesses in the system, full stop. In terms of victims of abuse, but I think it's particularly pertinent when we are talking about male victims, where, as you say, the spidey sense doesn't click. If you've got a woman presenting consistently with injuries that could be non-accidental, spidey senses click, don't they? But I don't think we've reached that point in terms of looking at it regarding men yet. Sorry, Danny.
No, I completely agree with what Mark and Claire and Andrew have already said. A lot of it is about both awareness raising and gender inclusive training, sort of is anti-stereotyping, and for older men particularly, as we see with older women, anti-ageist, as Mark was saying. The lack of GPs and doctors and support staff seeing that what would be termed natural older injuries in some cases may be a case of abuse. And a key barrier is male victims are afraid of being laughed at, as Andrew and Claire said, shamed, or not being understood. And there needs to be a whole sort of sector in health abuse, criminal justice, and other spheres, training that is gender inclusive and supportive. As well as this, I mean, the invisibility and marginalization of men and older men as victims, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later, is not helped by male and boy abuse towards men and boys being subsumed under the VAUG, Violence Against Women and Girls banner. There needs to be a separate strategy for men and boys that is able to focus on the specific needs, risk factors, and barriers that there exist for older men and men in general. As it is at the moment, men and boys do not see themselves as victims because they see VAUG, Violence Against Women and Girls, just the title alone suggests that men and boys are different and somewhat less worthy of being seen as victims and being supported.
Thanks for that, Danny. That's actually a point I was going to come in on. I said the legislation itself doesn't acknowledge male victims, and that's something I think that governments across the UK have to start taking quite seriously. And again, just a comment from me before I go to Fergus is, in Wales, our Live Fear Free helpline is hosted by Women's Aid, which in itself is a perceptual, not necessarily actual, but it's a perceptual barrier for male victims to be seeking support, because everything about our legislation, where our support network sits for victims generally, is about women as victims, not men. Sorry, Fergus.
Yeah, that's great. I think everyone's covered that very nicely. I just had one kind of small point on that, on kind of addressing underreporting. I think there's quite a lot of similarities we could draw between kind of encouraging men to come forward and talk about domestic abuse and encouraging men more generally to talk about their mental health. So I see a lot of similarities between kind of suicide prevention and what we're trying to do here.
Thanks, Fergus. So we've got some comments in the chat, which I'll talk about. So Mark Stewart is asking, when we're looking at the figure of 1 in 3 male, 1 in 3 victims being male, is masked by male perpetrators reporting the reaction to physical abuse as actual abuse. So, for example, a man attacking a woman, she hits him. Sometimes the police record the male as a victim of abuse rather than a retaliation against abuse. I'm not sure quite what Mark is getting at with that comment, but panel, is anybody happy to comment on that? I mean, he does say it's not about competition, but I do think, from my own perspective, it's sometimes a challenge that men are seen to be the perpetrators if they retaliate rather than victims retaliating, which I think is quite different than when statutory services look at female victims. Has anybody got a comment on that, Mark?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I just don't buy that. I mean, the fact that the police would automatically believe a man over a woman, there's no evidence of that. Anecdotally, I'd say it's probably the other way around, but I'm sorry, I'd like to see the evidence. It's not a competition is a key thing. I think that's what Mark said, but no, I don't believe the police will believe a man over a woman systematically.
Has anybody else got a comment on that before we move on to another question? No. The other comment, I think, again, is picking up what we've been talking about. So it's about improving men's understanding of abuse through mental health support groups. And I think that is really a good point. And I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Andy's Man's Club. It's very prevalent on social media. So is it worth maybe working through some intermediary organisations who actually have contact with men to start talking to them about issues of abuse? So anybody with a perspective on that?
I can.
Mark again.
Yeah, so I don't know. Right, I won't answer anything else for a while.
No,
I do a lot of broader work on men's health and inclusion. I've written a couple of papers on male suicide and men's health strategy. And what we're finding is a lot of social prescribing. And lots of these groups, Andy Man's clubs, but a huge number of other men's talk clubs, UK men's sheds. I mean, if you're looking at our demographic, UK men's sheds, you will get a number of either male victims or men who have been victims in the past using the social prescription in terms of these informal charities. And they are growing hugely in the UK. Over the last 5 years, a huge growth in UK men's sheds, anti-man clubs, lots of talking and walking groups. International Men's Day, which was a couple of weeks ago, really highlighted the volume of these organisations, and getting to those organisations, not for them to be more aware of domestic abuse, but also knowing where to signpost and refer men to is absolutely vital for us to get there. And also, in some respects, the growth of these groups is a failure of the state in its broadest sense, because men are going to these services and, you know, all the charities that we represent, often because they don't feel that the state, the health service, the mental health services, or whatever, are quite working for them. But yeah, we should be able to build those connections with those groups, even if it's just for referral pathways.
Thanks. I'm sorry, my questions have just jumped, so I've missed the one I was about to be talking about. Right. So yeah, I mean, I think this is a really pertinent point, actually, and I think this comes again to something around the systems and structures that we have in place. And it's from Kelly Murphy, and it's, could it be that some men are afraid that will bring the family unit, make it fall apart? So they may not want to end the relationship with the partner, they just want the abuse to stop. So knowing what they can do about stopping the abuse is important. And some men may be feeling that the abuse is a result of what the partner is going through in terms of health, so hormones, menopause, etc. So I suppose what support is available to abuse victims who actually want to keep the family unit together and just tackle the abuse as an issue within the relationship as opposed to enter the relationship. Geraldine, this might be right up your street.
Hey, so I suppose there's a few points I wanted to make. One, just to pick up on a point earlier. So in Northern Ireland, the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy doesn't include men and boys. It obviously, men and boys may be beneficiaries from some of the outcomes of that around challenging gender norms, etc. But the Northern Ireland Executive has taken a different approach to England and Wales, so they haven't claimed that it's to target that. And in Northern Ireland, our domestic and sexual abuse strategy is gender neutral, so should also be looking at the needs of men and boy victims in and of themselves. I think the question that was posed is a really good one, and it really touches to some of the challenges around how we respond to domestic abuse in general, but also with older men and, well, men in general, but also older men, in that I think there's sometimes a fear to report to statutory services because of a fear that there's going to be a criminal justice outcome. And for many people, they do just want the behaviour to stop and the abuse to stop. They're not necessarily wanting a potential criminal record. So in circumstances where maybe somebody is being financially abused by their son or daughter, they want the abuse to stop. They don't want the actual the person to end up, you know, the mother or father of their grandchildren to end up potentially with a criminal record or potentially facing a custodial sentence. And I think that's one of the challenges then around trying to get people to speak about this, and where it is important that we have other outcomes that can try and facilitate the needs of the actual victim and take on board their concerns. Obviously, if there's criminal behaviour, the law does have to act, and there's a safeguarding and public protection issue there, so it is a challenge. But I think having a lot of the points that have been made already, like by Mark and some of the other speakers, sorry, I'm not clearing everybody's name because I joined late, but it is, I think it's important that our support services are really helpful there, play a vital role in providing a confidential and secure place for people to discuss what's happening to them and then understand the choices and avenues that are available to them. And so I suppose that's just kind of just a few of my thoughts from what's been raised.
There's a really interesting question just come up in chat, which I'm going to jump to because I think it's quite an important one given the conversation we're having at the moment, and that's from Gemma Braithwaite, and she's asking if there's been consultation done with males who've had a lived experience about what media, comms, messages, etc., may have encouraged them to come forward, and I'll add to that and possibly recognise that they themselves were victims. So that's possibly over to you, Mark. As a specialist organisation, are there things that you can share with us that would help the other organisations who are presented here to be thinking about how they communicate with people who are potentially victims to support them in identifying themselves as such and seeking support?
Well, I mean, my other colleagues run, similar services. I mean, I think I'm sure they're coming as well. I mean, I think there's a number of issues. I mean, and my background's in comms before I joined this sector. The first thing is about directly explaining what domestic abuse is and using what I call gender nouns. So don't use imposters. If you're a victim of domestic abuse, contact us. Men will not see themselves in that. So you need to say if you're a female or male, or if you use non-binary, depending on what your comms guidelines are, but you have to use the word man or male in your comms, either in adverts, social media, on your websites. If you just put victims, men won't see themselves. So it's a slight tweak, but will make all the difference. And of course, that won't detract from any women contacting your helpline if you use the word woman or female, for example. Also, if you're using male-specific campaigns, and we recommend that, you explain what the types of abuse are. So don't just say we are a victim of domestic. If you're a male victim of domestic abuse, call us here. You have to say, is your partner doing X, Y, and Z? and then the light bulbs go off because men need to make that connection. Last couple of points, it's where men go, not where you think men should go. So, you know, don't pull up posters or leaflets or whatever in libraries or GP surgeries and think I've ticked the box. So barbers, hairdressers, sports clubs, put posters up in pubs as well, but also, as I said, UK men's sheds, all of those types of organisations. Facebook's absolutely crucial as well. Get things on community groups on Facebook, and also have a really good website, because a lot of guys will not want to contact any agency at all, whether it's representatives of all of us here or actually the state, if you like. They will want to get information, find out what is happening to them. Many of them will just go about getting out of the situation without actually telling anybody. But if you've got tips and tools and information and links elsewhere on websites, you'll find lots of men using that, and they won't tell anybody, but you will have done a grand job. So where men go, not where you think they should go, is a mantra that I use. I'm sure colleagues have got plenty more to add to that as well.
Yeah, does anybody else want to come in on that? Sorry, when I've got the chat open, I'm struggling to see all of you, so apologies if I'm missing any hands. I'm trying to work out how to move the chat around so I can see everybody properly. Does anybody else got anything to add on that? Claire?
Oh, sorry. We've definitely spoken to men who have said that they didn't ever even consider themselves to be a victim of domestic abuse, because all the imagery that they had seen, and I know things are changing and there is a definite effort being made, but all the imagery they had seen had either been a woman with an injury, or a child, you know, looking scared, or, you know, with a man leaning over a woman, and they just never ever considered that it could be a different way. It could be partner on partner, it could be, you know, adult on child, it could be a younger person, you know, perpetrating upon an older person. So they never even saw themselves to connect, that might be what's happening to me.
I think that's a really, really important point, and I'll move on actually to one of the other questions that's in the chat, and that's from Amanda Warburton, and that's really about us remembering that the abuser of male victims, and I think this does apply to older victims more generally as well, isn't always an intimate partner or ex-partner. So it is about not just looking at same-sex relationships, which we have talked about, but actually about children and grandchildren, and informal carers. I don't want to start going down the carer, paid carer route, because that'll take us into a complete wormhole we don't want to get into. But, you know, are other people who have a relationship with the individual, that can be the perpetrator. So what can we be doing about that in terms of raising awareness and understanding of how that different relationship impacts on how the abuse is both perpetrated and then dealt with? So who wants to jump in on that? Danny?
Yeah, I'll just sort of broadly firstly agree with what Claire, Mark and everyone else has said about the previous question and the visibility of male victims. But on this one, in Hourglass particularly, we see for older victims and older male victims too, that rather than it being intimate partners, although intimate partner perpetrators are a large proportion of perpetrator types, it is predominantly older sons and daughters and grandchildren. This is sort of linked to the fact that in Hourglass we see the largest sort of form of abuse being economic, but generally economic tied with other forms of abuse, economic with psychological, economic with physical, in some cases economic with sexual, economic with neglect. It's a hard thing really to explain, because generally because generally the general public's idea of domestic abuse is only intimate partner violence. And for older victims in particular, where, I mean, the disbelief really that older victims in general, older women and older men are victims, is another barrier really. So it's hard. Awareness raising is key really, as we've been saying. Visibility is key. Claire and Mark were saying that sort of men need to be represented in communication literature, and communication forms, and older men especially. Older men don't see themselves. Organizations are reticent to put images of older men on because it's just seen as sort of such a niche thing, or something that doesn't happen. Although we only really see about sort of 1 to 2% of our cases being sexual violence related, sexual violence, literature around sexual violence and communication images around sexual violence will never show an older man, and in a lot of cases will never show an older woman either. Older men and older women are seen as asexual, or just the topic in general of sexual violence, sexual exploitation of older men and women is seen as taboo. So there's so much work that needs to be done on this topic, and awareness raising is the first step, really.
Thank you. Anybody? Andrea?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Danny has said about awareness raising, but I also think there's a problem in terms of kind of the way that relationships are very short term now, very episodic, with practitioners across disciplines, really, because certainly in my experience, when you're working with an older person, you know, whether it's an adult child or grandchild, if it's an older man being financially abused by somebody within their family, it can take an awful long time and an awful lot of work, really, to talk through what's happening and to get to the point where that abuse is acknowledged and realised, because of course people can ignore it. They can worry about being isolated. They can worry if they're needing care, well, who's going to care for me? So I think the fact is that if you haven't got those relationships in place, that makes disclosure and attending to the issues all the more difficult. So I think there's a systemic issue there as well.
Thank you. And Fergus, do you have any perspective on this?
Yeah, so I think in terms of Scotland, we're kind of hampered by the domestic abuse legislation. It only really covers intimate partner relationships. It doesn't cover, you know, family relationships like son or friends, or in terms of older people, it doesn't cover relationships with carers. Or so I think we're really hampered in terms of that. I'm not exactly sure how that would relate to the media comm side of things, but yeah.
And that actually leads us quite neatly into another issue that we can talk about, and that's around legal and criminal justice bias. So the legislative framework is not particularly helpful in terms of identifying male victims or even older victims of abuse, because of the way in which it's constructed, which is very much around violence against women. So what sort of additional barriers does this throw up, and what could we be doing about it? What do we need to be saying to government and legislature about this issue? Andrea?
Yeah, I think there's also an additional barrier. I mean, I'll come to the issue of in Wales, we don't talk about violence against women and girls, but violence against women, domestic abuse, sexual violence, but I'll come to that a bit later on. But I think the additional barrier is this whole concept of elder abuse. We don't use the term elder abuse because it's not a separate category of abuse. And I think the fact is that when you frame the abuse of older people as elder abuse, it automatically is encouraging assumptions around the fact that people are abused because of a problem with frailty and older age, for example, whereas they actually may have lived in domestic abuse relationships for many, many years. And following on from that, I then think you get very practical solutions, perhaps rather than therapeutic solutions. You may have things that, you know, solutions that are focused on daycare or respite, because you're making assumptions around carer stress. And we know that to go with all of this, older people are actually not often given any access to criminal justice. you know, they are dealt with within safeguarding systems, and they aren't necessarily offered to contact with criminal justice agencies because assumptions are made, or they wouldn't want to go down that route, that's too traumatic. And all of these assumptions are very ageist. So I think the whole thing around elder abuse is something that we really need to unpack, really, because it's not giving older people parity in terms of dealing with these situations.
Absolutely. I mean, it's one thing I feel very strongly about is if we're talking about sexual violence against an older person, yes, it is a safeguarding issue, but actually it's a crime. And I think we're too keen to go down the safeguarding route. So we're tackling the symptom as opposed to the root cause of what's happening to that individual. So sorry, Geraldine, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I think I would agree with the concerns raised about decisions being taken under the safeguarding auspice rather than the criminal justice piece. And certainly I get a sense in Northern Ireland, and I would agree with the previous speaker around ageism, and I see it with children as much as I can see it with older people, where there's really a perception that social services and police services are taking decisions based on what they believe is in the best interest of the individual, whenever the individual isn't being asked or considered for their own views and thoughts on it. And I think that's something that we need to address. Going back to the point around the legislation, in Northern Ireland, we quite late in the day introducing coercive control legislation that was only introduced last year in the Domestic Abuse and Civil Proceedings Act. However, our coercive control legislation is very clear that it's not intimate partner, that it's close family members as well. And I am hopeful that some of the campaigns that, particularly the media campaigns around that, have recognised the broad range of the broad types of abuse that can take place, but also the different types of victims that there can be. So it's not just one gender, it's not just younger people, it's not just same-sex relationships, and that's a challenge. I think that one of the issues we have is that where we do identify potentially a good ad campaign, it's having the resources to continue to run it. So obviously it's, you know, it only reaches the amount of people in that schedule that of run, but it needs money and continual investment. And this, the challenge with this issue isn't something that's going to be dealt with in a big bang. It's a drip. It needs layers of action that need to be taken across all government departments.
Thank you. And Mark?
Yeah, I mean, just on the issue about the legislation. I mean, all legislation in the UK, and that includes across all 4 of the nations, is gender neutral. I mean, it has. I mean, it's part of, without sounding like some historian, it's part of the British Constitution. So each law has to apply to everyone equally. It's about the strategies and the policies that then deliver that legislation. And the issue with the violence against women and girls strategy, I'm talking really about England here, but I know it happens obviously elsewhere, is that there has been big challenges from not only organisations in the domestic abuse field in terms of those that support men, but also in the sexual violence and sexual abuse. So, you know, a boy who is sexually abused is classed by the government as being a victim of violence against a girl. So it isn't just about domestic abuse, it's across the whole gamut of stalking, false marriage on a based abuse. And I mean, we've, as a collective, there's about 16 organisations covering all of that. We have continually written to the government to say we want a parallel strategy, and the government, the Westminster government's continually refused, said that said in some respects that they were worried about what women's organisations would say. The thing is, I've no evidence of any women's organisation being opposed to men and boys being taken out of that strategy, or it doesn't negate the experiences or the support for male victims. But research that will be coming out in early next year, with about 350 victims of domestic abuse and sexual violence, shows it really minimises them. It adds to their trauma. especially in kind of post-separation or once they're out the abuse. And 2/3 have said that they would think that the strategy should be gender neutral, and 1/3 that it should be just for men. And I think the research is probably going to recommend that it should be a parallel strategy, because gender neutral could then diminish the focus that we need to have on female victims of domestic abuse. So you end up actually not supporting anyone specifically. But there have been big campaigns on this. We may have a change of government in the next year or so, and maybe that will change, but certainly there are campaigns about having a parallel strategy, and I know Hourglass have been supportive of those.
Thanks, Mark. Does anybody else have anything on this particular subject?
I was just going to speak a bit about men being seen as less vulnerable when it comes to being seen as true victims and things like this. And I think part of getting change in legislation and things like that involves data gathering. And where I see problems, where we would see it, would be in some of the risk assessments that we use. In Northern Ireland, we would use the DASH form. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that was originally designed to be used for women and for young women. So what we would love to see is that risk assessment moves and shifts and changes, you know, through people's lives, so that we're doing accurate assessments for people where we meet them, that they don't have to fit into, you know, a box of an assessment tool that was made for someone much younger or in a different set of circumstances. And then we'd be able to gather proper data to be able to feed back, you know, into legislation to be able to, you know, help to change these things. Yeah.
Those raised quite an interesting point as well. So we've talked about under-identification of men as victims due to a variety of different factors, both perceptual and also the legislative framework in which we all work. But actually, a question that's just popped into my head, and apologies because that's the way my brain works, is actually if men identify themselves as a victim, where are they going to go in terms of a refuge, a safe space? What sort of experience do we have across the other nations around where male victims could go to escape the abusive situation that they're in? Claire, you're still mic is open, so I might jump on you first.
Well, in Northern Ireland, we don't have any male refuges for victims of domestic abuse. So for any men or their children, if they need to seek refuge, we have worked with men who have escaped their home after physical assault and have ended up in a homeless hostel, which, you know, from speaking to the men directly, a particular man who ended up terrified because there was no safe refuge for him, and that was the alternative and the only alternative he had. So he took it, but ended up, his words, I've jumped out of the frying pan and into the frying pan, because he was then in a different set of different set of vulnerabilities there.
And that really feeds into the point that was made earlier about not wanting the relationship to break down. Because if a man is wanting to live with his children to safeguard them, there truly is nowhere for them to go. Andrea, I think the situation is similarly dire in Wales, but I think we do have a male refuge in Wales, but I could be making that up. Andrea.
No, I believe there is male refuge available, but I think, you know, when you're talking about older men as well, or older people, you know, you can be in a situation where the accommodation needs are very difficult to meet. So you've got that added complication, haven't you, where, you know, older people perhaps don't feel it's right for them to go into a refuge space, which is mainly for younger people, younger women in particular. If there are any issues around mobility, for example, that is an added complication. So I think the accommodation, you know, there are, in my understanding, there is some available, but you know, that's certainly something that needs to be worked upon, I think.
It is very limited, and the accessibility is an issue. And I did some research about 18 months ago on the Gwent footprint. Apologies for those who aren't in Wales, but that's a very large area. And there were 4 accessible rooms across the whole of that area that would be available to people with physical impairments or potentially to older people. And I don't think Gwent had a single space for a male victim. So I think that's something really important for us to keep considering, is if we're going to be looking at encouraging men to report and putting in place the legislative and policy structures that men can report, we actually have to think about when they're there, where they're then going to go. Because it's a huge barrier for women escaping a domestic abuse or sexual violence situation, having to go to a refuge. But if there's not a refuge to go to, what are we really expecting people to be able to do? Danny?
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. I'd like to just echo completely what Andrea just said around that. We see it with older women too, that older women don't want to may not want to go to refuge where there are young women, or women with children, or if they have accessibility issues. But the thing is that at least older women can go to women-focused refuges. As we've all been saying, there are barely any. I think about 22, there are maybe 22 as part of the Women's Aid Federation refuges that will support male victims. That may only be in England. I'm not sure about the numbers in the other nations, but I know they're very low. And also organisations like Refuge, who sort of are the first stop for people seeking refuge, support predominantly women and children. As Andrew said, older male victims may suffer from mobility, accessibility issues too. And although there was funding, I know Mark's talked about this, not yet, but it probably will. There was funding given by the government as part of the Domestic Abuse Act in 2021 to local councils to implement safe accommodation. Where are the results? I mean, there are a number of councils I know of. Wokingham, for example, Mark and I both work with them, are doing sort of focused stuff and raising issues on support for male victims. But sort of anecdotally, it just doesn't seem to be sort of 2 years on, and I appreciate sort of the pandemic has affected this, but the support just doesn't seem to be emerging quickly enough, or sort of across the country enough, and especially for older men. Who, as we've seen through all of this, while male victims as a whole are invisible and marginalised as victims, older men are then the next step, because they then have to deal with the ageist attitudes too, that make older victims in general marginalised and invisible. It's concerning, extremely concerning.
Thank you. Fergus, do you have anything to come in on this? Sorry, you keep hiding under my chat box, so I never know if you're going to put your hand up or not.
I'm still here. Yeah, I think the situation in Scotland is much the same as it is in Northern Ireland. There are no male refuges for domestic abuse victims. I think most of the time they end up in emergency accommodation if they really do need to leave, and it's just not indicative of like a place where you can start to rebuild your life. And most of these people are in crisis. They might have other issues related to like drug problems or alcohol issues. So it's really not an ideal situation at all. They need somewhere to go. We've also seen people actually move countries. They'll move down to England or Wales to seek refuge. So really need to get some local refuges here.
Yeah, James Ahern has just put in the comment that we do actually have 3 male refuges in Wales, but if you look at the size of our population, that's but a drop in the ocean. And worryingly, he said he's had a victim offered a tent as a solution, which is just, again, if we're talking about somebody fleeing a abusive relationship, they're already at the most vulnerable, and we give them a tent. But sorry, Mark.
I mean, there has been a gradual increase in talk about England and Wales in the safe accommodation options, partly driven by the Domestic Abuse Act 2021, and there has been additional money. One of the issues is it's money for support services, but not for bricks and mortar, which has been one of the problems. But there are more coming on board, and often it's a partnership between the Commission Domestic Abuse Service, the local authority, and a housing association. And it's kind of like, because and the key thing is, and I would, you know, keep urging colleagues across the 4 nations, use the law, because there's legislation that basically means around homelessness acts. I'm sure it's the same in Scotland and Wales, and the domestic abuse and housing acts, and they can't discriminate. If you've got a woman with 2 children or an older woman and she meets a certain level of risk and harm, and if you've got a man who also has the same level of risk and harm from domestic abuse, for him not to be offered the same level, could be different, but the same level of support is illegal. It's illegal under your equalities legislation, let alone any housing or homelessness. I know it's easier said than done, but I really think quoting equalities legislation is really important, because if he receives a lesser service because he's a man, that is illegal. That's a breach in equality and human rights legislation. And I think it's really important, obviously, to be civil about it, but actually start to raise that type of thing in conversations. Because I think that's one of the reasons there has been a gradual growth, is because of the equalities legislation, which is, if you like, trumps, you know, councils can't say we can't support this person, this man, and you say, well, if a woman in the same situation, you would, therefore you're breaching equalities human rights legislation, and that often makes them think.
Geraldine,
Can I just add one last point?
Yeah,
Sorry. Go to the politicians. Don't just go to the officials, the director of housing, social services. Go, if you're dealing with a local council, go to the cabinet member, the elected councillor responsible, because they're politically accountable for this. Or, of course, go to the government minister, rather than going necessarily through the officers of the government. Go to the politicians, because that makes, again, the politicians think, because often they're unaware of these problems. Sorry to jump in, Andrea, but before I'd add that in.
No, I just add a cynical viewpoint here as an ex-civil servant. Just be aware that the officials still get to put a spin on what response you're likely to get from your elected politician, but that's just my cynical hat. We'll ignore that comment. I've got a couple of really interesting comments in the chat now. I'm just going to raise them and open it up for comments. We've got one from Tim Turney, who's saying that a new police domestic abuse training video for professionals only contains examples of female victims. So what are we going to do about that? Because the police are potentially the first port of call for an awful lot of people, and if police aren't recognising men as victims, we have a major issue before we even try and start talking about escape from, refuge from, any redress through the criminal justice system. And then Michelle Keane really supports that comment by saying about society being gender biased, and the amount of time she spends trying to educate people that it isn't just about women and girls. So, you know, if we've got police not recognising it, by not even including it in a training video, where do we go from here? Depressing comment, but Claire, you look like you have a pensive thought coming there. No? Okay. Anybody got a comment on that? I mean, if you just feel it's a massively uphill battle if we're not even getting police recognising that men can be victims in their training materials.
I suppose, can I come in there, Andrea?
Yeah, please do, Geraldine.
I think in Northern Ireland, we probably are maybe in a better position. I don't think that is the training video in Northern Ireland. If it is, can the person let me know? I do think that there is a greater recognition in Northern Ireland from within the police, and there's been a lot of training, particularly with the coercive control legislation. And as Clara mentioned earlier, you know, over 30% of our recorded domestic abuse offences, the victims are male. Where if I was in England and Wales, if that was the case, I would be writing to the police and crime commissioners and flagging it as a concern there, because I do think it's been stated several times throughout this morning's webinar, the need for awareness raising and recognition and breaking down those kind of biases and is key amongst our frontline service responders. So police need to be able to see that. So I'm preaching to the converted here in terms of why it's needed, but I probably would start with the Police and Crime Commissioner if it was me.
Andrea.
Yeah, I mean, just a quick comment. So we do have police representation on the Commissioner's Stopping Abuse Action Group, which is really helpful. So we have those conversations there, and certainly I've presented as part of the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Conference with the National Police Chiefs Council, which is again really important in raising awareness. We've talked to them about the findings of the research. But one thing I wanted to go back to, if I could, and it's a bit about the accommodations. There's a bit of a reflection on some of the previous comments. I also think, you know, I agree with you completely, Geraldine, about breaking down biases. And I also think there's a bit about ageism and working with older people themselves who've internalized ageist attitudes and assumptions, because I'm not sure, you know, the older people, when they have thoughts perhaps about, you know, well, that person's younger, they should be able to have that accommodation or whatever, how equipped or able they would necessarily feel to challenge some of these biases. So I think that's a really important area of work as well. So yeah, and something that we are looking again as an office to do is to do work around ageism and abuse, because I think that ageism legitimizes abuse and certainly shapes the responses of professionals and practitioners to the abuse of older people.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to come in on that before we move on to the next topic, which is getting a fair bit of comment in the chat? And that's around something that we talked about earlier, which is where it's older adults having abuse from children stroke younger relatives. Sorry, Danny, do you want to come in on that and then we'll move on? Sorry.
Yeah, I'd just like to wholeheartedly agree with what Andrea said. And I know that she said that the Welsh Older People's Commissioner are doing good work on that front, which we should see sort of across the nations, more of a focus on ageism and ageist attitudes, and how, as Andrea said, internalized they can be, and that as an additional barrier to older victims seeking help.
Thank you. So yeah, so moving on then, so there's a couple of comments in here about adults being abused by children, and I think the one that's a particular challenge is the comment that's made by Peter Bond, which is around where the adult child has actually got learning difficulties or potential mental health issues, and what do we do in that situation? So we've actually got both a vulnerable perpetrator as well as a vulnerable victim. So not a difficult one for you to maybe come up with some solutions for. Anybody want to wade in on that as an issue? Because I think it's something that I've come across where we've had a perpetrator who has a dementia. And it's very difficult to actually, and I'll defend the police in this, it's very difficult to deal with somebody when your perpetrator actually doesn't necessarily have capacity, but there's still a victim. And what did we do in that situation to support both the perpetrator and the victim effectively? Claire?
I think it's extremely important to understand the older man's position, if that was the case. So to speak up about what's happening to them is a betrayal, and a betrayal of someone in their family who may have other vulnerabilities themselves. So what we would see is, a victim would be making excuses for that person, and trying to kind of write it out rather than speak up against them, because they wouldn't want them to come to any harm because of their vulnerabilities, themselves. It's a very, very complex situation.
Andrea?
It is complex and you know, is absolutely an issue. I think everybody struggles to work out a solution to sometimes. I am aware that there are researchers looking at this whole issue of what's now called carer harm. So that may be that carers that harm in the course of their caregiving roles and responsibilities, but also those who are harmed, and that could be an older person. So you know, and there's all sorts of issues around intentionality there and how that is dealt with. But yeah, I certainly know that is being looked at and discussed, and I believe it's there's been some work in Dublin, in University College of Dublin, on a good practice guide in dealing with those sorts of issues. So I think, yeah, there isn't an easy solution there, and I do think there needs to be a lot more work done in that area, really.
Any other comments? I think it's one of those that's it's just an incredibly difficult issue to deal with, and it goes to the whole heart of our support systems, particularly for parents who are caring for adult children, and in some circumstances, possibly those children weren't even expected to survive until adulthood, and certainly not late adulthood. And I think we're all aware of particularly for individuals with Down syndrome, dementia can hit quite a lot earlier than it does in the main population. And we just don't have the structures in place to be able to support both victim and perpetrator in those sorts of circumstances. I'm moving through the chat because I've spotted Amanda Warburton has very helpfully posted that she's developed an older people's dash. So when we pull together the details from today, we'll send that out to everybody. I'm sure that'll be really interesting for everybody to have a look at, because it's I'll certainly be looking at it as soon as we're done today, because I do think that the way in which the dash has been constructed, it in itself is not necessarily helpful for people who are working with older victims. So I'd be really interested to have a look at that and maybe put out some commentary after the event. Also, Michelle Keane has helpfully clarified there are 19 organisations that offer refuge or safe house provision for male victims in the UK, which has got a total of 78 spaces. And of those spaces, only 20 are dedicated to male victims of domestic abuse. So we are talking about a real paucity of provision here. So I think what would be quite useful for us to start talking about now is that, you know, we've talked an awful lot about the fact that older men may suffer from more than just the traditional stereotype of domestic abuse and sexual violence. So, in our experience, what sort of abuse are older men more likely to experience? Notwithstanding the fact that they can be victims of both violence and sexual violence, but actually, where are the vulnerabilities that we're all seeing on a daily basis? Anybody want to start? So I'm moving my chat box around so I can see everybody, see if your hands are coming up. Danny.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. And just quickly, Amanda Warburton also wrote a very good research report on sexual violence against older people in hospital in 2021, which is available on our website. If anyone wants to read further on that. As I said earlier, predominantly at Hourglass, we see male victims being suffering from economic abuse, generally around 40 to 45%, I think 44.7% this year were victims of financial / economic abuse. And then it's either generally psychological or physical as the next main types of abuse seen on our helpline for older male victims. But sort of, it's not particularly helpful, if I'm honest, outlining sort of individual abuse types, because as we all know, generally there is abuse doesn't happen singularly. They are sort of abuse types are mixed together and merged together, where we're seeing different abuse types committed by perpetrators against the victim. So a mix of sexual and physical, or as I said, psychological and economic. So sometimes it's not particularly helpful saying, well, we saw economic abuse, because it sort of disguises the true nature of abuse. against victims, where it is not just a singular abuse and then sort of nicking some money from someone's purse and everything else is lovely. It's the coercive control, it's psychological, it's abuse and or physical, or sort of putting someone in fear of their life being harmed, or aspects to then get that economic resources. So really, it's a broad, a really broad set of abuse types, and really sort of what we see, and I'm sure everyone will agree with this. As Claire mentioned earlier, the data is just not good enough. So what we're seeing is just a drop in the ocean, really, of what is likely out there concerning all types of abuse against older people, but sort of as we're talking about male victims today. Male victims, and as we've been discussing, sort of the amount of huge barriers that are stopping male victims from coming forward is again sort of just illustrates that we really don't have a true idea of the data and the understanding, and that's sort of the first issue and first step necessary to go forward. As I mentioned briefly earlier, the least common abuse type we see across both older women and older men is sexual abuse, but again, it's really sort of underreported compared to the other abuse types because of ageist attitudes, and for male victims in generally, ideas around gender, ideas around masculinity, ideas around shame and fear and the thought of being laughed at, and sort of it's. And I did notice someone in the comments mentioned around BME, asked around BME, men and older men. And again, even further than this, the data is just not there, or the attention has not been put on enough about intersectionality and other victim groups, BME, LGBT groups. It really just isn't there. The data isn't there for men in general, but sort of when you're even diving deeper down, it just gets less and less and less and less. But sort of there are sort of specific ideas around masculinity that might be more prevalent in certain BME groups as well. That will then be an additional barrier to coming forward. But as we've all been saying, the problem is that the data is just not there. That is the first step, really. The last big prevalence data report on older victims in general was in 2000, the early 2000s, 2004, 2007, one of the two. And since then, we just haven't seen anything. And there's not been a big prevalence report on male victims or older male victims, really, that's sort of effective and covers the four nations at all. And until we see that, sorry, I'll shut up and let someone else.
No, carry on. No, carry on.
No.
I was just going to say, when I went into post in 2008 and took responsibility for older people's strategy, I was horrified by the fact that the crime survey didn't record anybody over the age of 65 as being a victim of any sort of abuse. So we fought hard to get that statistic, but it does mean it's really difficult for us to track prevalence when we didn't even start recording the information until probably about 2012, I want to say. So we don't have an awful lot of information out there, and we've had a pandemic in the middle of all of that, which we know impacted massively on older people in terms of every aspect of their life. And you have to make the correlation that there's for domestic abuse victims, however it's perpetrated, that had to be much more of a challenging situation to be in as well. So yeah, I mean, not having the data is a huge issue. And again,
sorry, Andrea, just come on that. I could talk about the lack of data all day, but I won't. But yeah, as you just said, the crime survey for England Wales just recently has allowed us to see older victims. It still currently is very limited and only focuses on offences within the own home. So we have no idea about care home at the moment, or offences against care home or outside, really. I know that there are conversations, and I'm actually sort of talking to someone from the ONS a bit later today around that. So there are sort of things moving forward on that, but it's just been, it's really too little too late. It has been for us to get a coherent sense of what is actually going on. So I'll let someone else talk now.
I'm sorry, I missed who was first, but I'm going to go for Claire first and then I'll come back to you, Andrea. Sorry.
I just wanted to add to what Danny was saying about the types of abuse that older men are experiencing, and just to highlight that it's often what's not being done. So behaviour that fails to do something, whether that's a failure to provide medication, failure to provide personal care, isolation, enforced isolation, failure to help or facilitate just social gatherings or socialisation of any sort. Would be what we would be hearing from older men who may have an illness or a disability or both, and are very reliant upon their perpetrator at certain, at the mercy of them for these things. So just to highlight that sometimes what's not being done for them as well as what is directly being done to them.
Thank you. And Andrea?
Yeah, just very brief comment around data, if I can. First of all, there's a problem with the way that data is recorded as well. Organisations don't agree on what is older age, for example. There are different ages across organisations. I think, again, there's a whole issue around understandings of domestic abuse. So, for example, if an older man is financially abused by a family member, that may not be recorded as domestic abuse. So that wouldn't be showing up. And in terms of intersectionality, I think whatever data is collected on older people absolutely has to be mined much more carefully, because, sometimes you see data that is 60 plus. But we know that older men are not a homogenous group. They have all different sorts of needs. You can have 30 years difference of experience in that. Plus you've got older men from Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups, for example, within there, or LGBTQ plus communities. But those questions, there isn't that analysis being done. So we are missing out on understanding the specific needs of individual groups.
Thank you, Andrea. And Mark?
Yeah, it was just, I mean, obviously there's lots of nuances in intersectionality, but just to, make the issue about some of the things that are helpline. And I think we do need to really do a lot of research. And I think if we can find an academic that can contact all the organisations involved in this and actually do some, look at some of the themes, but certainly we're finding second marriages when men are getting married when they're 60 plus is a particular theme. Also a difference between men who are 60 plus and retired and not retired. So men who aren't retired from work have better access to support services than men who are retired, because one of the things when our helpline team mentioned, they're almost in a lockdown situation, because when they're retired and they're with their the person controlling them, they have no means of actually contacting outside organizations, because there's a difference between the dynamic between retired older men and men who still may be working, and also issues around financial control. The taking over of finances has a real issue, and as I said, it drips down into children being cut out of inheritance, wills, all of that type of thing. And we do need more understanding of the granularity around that, as well as the intersectional issues as well. We get lots of daughters and sons calling who are in their 40s, 30s, worried about their dad in a second marriage.
That leads into actually a really interesting comment that's come up into the chat around the Office of the Public Guardian. What are they looking at doing to protect older people when powers of attorney have been applied and the perpetrator is actually the person who's got power of attorney? And that's a really interesting comment that I think probably does warrant some consideration, and possibly an over to you, Geraldine, for consideration around that, because these people actually have the legal power to abuse.
Yeah, we don't have that office in Northern Ireland as far as but it does resonate with one of the points I did want to make, and it's back to this awareness piece as well around, we talk about we've spoken a lot about support agencies and statutory agencies, but also the awareness that needs to be done across, you know, like our legal profession, so law society. So Northern Ireland, anything like that, you would normally go to your local solicitor. But then also with banks as well, and bank staff, so where they have people coming in with maybe their relative who wants to transfer monies across, you know, it's that. I think we've got much better with online fraud, and put the banking system has been much more alert to strangers trying to potentially access your finances, but that awareness that is needed around financial abuse, where actually the person is a trusted family friend from our relative, is key. So I definitely think that there's more work to be done there around their responsibilities as well. But I don't believe we have that office that you've just described, because I've never heard of it before.
Sorry to put you on the spot then. So we're getting to the absolute last 5 minutes of this seminar. I can't believe it's gone so quickly, but this is just such an important issue, and there are obviously so many different perspectives on it that is partly why it is so challenging. So can I just thank all of our delegates for attending today, and I hope that you found it useful. I'll remind everybody about the evaluation email, and how important it is that we all get feedback from today's event. And just a quick sales pitch, we do have another webinar coming up on the 25th of January 2024, which will be looking at the sexual abuse of older people, and all the information about how you can access that event will be available via the website, and we'll be sending out the links when we send out the evaluation pro forma. But I'd like to actually end by handing over to the people who are the most important people today in that, and asking our panel if they could all just leave us with one final comment for us to be thinking about as we exit what's been a really thought-provoking and slightly worrying hour and a half of seminar. So I'm going to move around the screen in the order in which you present yourself. So I'm going to start with Claire again, sorry, but you're in my top left-hand corner. So
that's okay. Thank you for having me today. I suppose the message from the Men's Advisory Project would be to those who are coming in contact with older men is to just broaden your curiosity. Just have a think holistically what's happening for this person, and to consider that perhaps there might be something else going on for them. Just to consider that whenever you're doing risk assessment or support or whatever way you may interact with that person.
Thank you. Fergus?
Hi. So I guess kind of one of the things that I was thinking about throughout today was vulnerability, and how that is impacted, especially by old age. You know, there are so many things that kind of play into that. Just the fact that they're going to have to rely on other people opens them up to abuse. We always say, you know, the only thing that people need to do to become victims is to give their trust to somebody that doesn't deserve it and that will abuse that trust. So yeah, that's kind of what I take away today, is be careful about vulnerability. I think that's kind of one of the key things around this area.
Thank you, Fergus. And Andrea?
I guess for service providers as well, to think about the way they are using their advertising materials, but to think about the way that they are equipped and may need to change to meet the needs of older men and older women. And that's certainly something that we are focused on in our work with Welsh Government. So,
thank you. And Mark?
It's been a long year, so I might have been a bit more shouty than I normally am. But the key thing is, building on what colleagues have said, things are better now than they were 5-10 years ago for male victims. Progress is still slow, and we can see this in this demographic, but we've just got to keep pushing on. Just keep pushing on, and then we will get there. That's my overriding message.
Thanks, Mark. And Geraldine?
I suppose in terms of kind of the broader piece that's ran through this, from my perspective, one of the key priorities really for us is around the data and understanding more, and certainly we're committed to doing more research. So I've just commissioned more research into the experience of adult males in Northern Ireland, of the intimate partner violence piece, which obviously is only one part of this, but is one of the areas that we're focused on, but how important that data our data is needed to help inform our decision making, and that runs across all of our statutory agencies as well in terms of the piece around the how we disaggregate that to identify need. And then I suppose in a more individual basis, and for me it's an issue with absolutely every victim of crime, we can have all of our frameworks and policies and forms to complete which help us to, and risk assessments which help us to determine need, and of course they're important, but first and foremost it's about meeting the person as an individual and individually assessing their needs in the context that they're living, and that's a challenge for everybody, but obviously for male victims as well, and that needs assessment is informed by understanding and then the advocacy to ensure that that's in place, and that's again a priority for us.
Thank you. And Danny?
Well, obviously, I'd just like to echo what everyone has just said, really. I'd love to say something about data, but Geraldine has just very nicely put it. So instead, I'll just talk about making sure that male victims and older male victims don't feel invisible. I think that is key, really. Sort of, this is an extremely important victim group that needs to be seen as equal victims to all other victim groups. And that includes, as we're saying, sort of the AME, LGBTQ plus victims as well under sort of male victims banner. But no, sort of we need to make sure that this victim group stop feeling invisible. And as Mark said, sort of progress is being made, but it's being made slowly. And we need to start, they've been pushing for a separate strategy, violence against men and boys, take it away from, make it more, as Geraldine saying, towards Northern Ireland, where sort of there's more of a focus not only on Vogue, but yeah, stop letting this victim group just sort of be diminished and be made invisible. That would be my key point.
Thank you. And again, thank you everybody for attending today and the questions. Apologies if we haven't got to your questions today, but we will make the effort to follow up on comments that have been made after the event, and everything that's been said will be recorded and sent out to people. And again, massive thank you to all for attending, and I hope you found the debate that we've had today useful. Thank you.